Well, it's really wonderful to have you all here tonight, and I wonder if, as we open, you might join me in a word of prayer. Holy One, we give you thanks for gathering this community together. We rejoice at the opportunity to meet you in one another. And we give thanks for Martin Copenhaver, who joins us here tonight, to offer his words that we all might grow deeper in our faith in you and love for one another. Bless us each and bless us all now this evening, in Christ's name. Amen. Friends, it's my distinct pleasure, and I'm very excited to welcome Martin Copenhaver to join us tonight to speak about his book, Room to Grow. Martin is the president of Andover Newton Theological School and was the senior pastor at Village Church in Wellesley during a portion of my tenure there. Martin is the author of many books, a wonderful speaker, and so without further ado, I'd like to turn the evening over to him. Martin, it's wonderful to have you here.
It's on me or something. It's really, truly wonderful to be here. The GPS took me to the Unitarian Church just next door. And they said, you're mostly in the wrong place. Not entirely, but in any case, I was grateful. They said, just take a turn to the right and you'll get there. So I am a huge fan of your new minister. Are some of you members of the search committee that, okay, so I think you know that I'm a huge fan of your new minister. And I don't know how it is with you, but for me, I'm never quite settled with when a loved one has moved to a new place until I see him or her in that place. And that's how I feel tonight, because I've not been here before. And it's really, truly wonderful to see this beautiful space and all of you. And I will rest just a little easier. What was that?
You'll let us keep him?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you know how blessed you are to have him as your minister, and so that's really wonderful. So, and I'm grateful that some of you have read this book. I'll see just what I intend to do here is just say a few words about the book. Then I actually will read a portion, just so, I don't know, it might be interesting for you to, some of you have not read it, and but those of you who have, to hear my voice in my voice of the writing, and then we'll just open it up for conversation and see where it goes. And you can take this wherever you would like. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, I've written 7 books, and this one is particularly dear to me because it is comprised of sermons that I first gave in my then congregation in Wellesley Village Church. And I had an opportunity to work on this after I left the church and before I started as president of Andover Newton. So it was just a wonderful way to kind of reflect on my time in that great church, and it felt in some ways like a chance to kind of gather that time, which is really a privilege. I wrote this publisher that I've had some experience with, and I said, I know there are often publishers will just run away from a collection of sermons, which basically this is, and they said, well, show us what you got. So I was really grateful, and it became an opportunity to. I went through all these files, and actually when I went through the files, after I went through the files, I was able to throw the files out because I felt like, well, okay, I've got this, and so preaching at its best is decidedly oral. It is when preachers will sometimes talk about writing a sermon. Well, it's kind of a misnomer in some ways, because even if you're writing a manuscript of a sermon, writing it like paragraph and paragraph, it is not for the eye, but it's for the ear. And one of the really difficult things as a preacher is to make sure you may be used to writing term papers, you may be used to writing annual reports, this is something different, because it's not, the sermon is not what's on the page. The sermon is what happens when someone stands before a congregation and speaks something of the good news. And I've spent some time teaching preaching along the ways, and that's one of the hardest things for new preachers to get straight, is a sermon is not what's on the page. So I've spent a lot of time trying to write sermons, prepare sermons, a term I prefer, for the ear. And yet when I went about this, I had to do it in reverse. So for instance, something that works very well, if it's done right, in speaking, an oral presentation, in a sermon, is the gift of repetition. There might be a theme or a phrase or a sentence or an image that you go back to through a sermon, and that really works if it's done right. But on the written page does not work. So I had this funny experience of having worked so hard to prepare a sermon for the ear, to then go back and have to say, what does it look like to have it on the page and to be read? So the title of this volume is a combination of the Apostle Paul and my mother. So the Apostle Paul has this wonderful image in Romans where he says, put on Christ. There's a story behind this. That's my son who's on his honeymoon in Chile. No. Got married on Saturday. I'm sure he's fine. He made sure he had the right data plan when he left. This wonderful image of put on Christ, and put on in the sense of put on an article of clothing. And some translations help us understand that by saying, clothe yourself with Christ. Clothe yourself with Christ. And I think of Augustine, who said that baptism is God's wardrobe. It's a wonderful image, isn't it? I mean, so you put something on, and the reason you put it on is so that you will take on the role that you will be, as much as you're able to be Christ in your dealings with others. But that's both a beautiful image. It's also quite daunting, intimidating to put on Christ as one would put on a suit of clothes. And the way that I had been helped in that image was by my mother, who, when I was a boy, if you go shopping for clothes, that she would always like reach for a size larger than what you are. I don't know, was that true for you or whatever? And, you have to roll up the cuff in a way that you tried to make look cool, but is actually sort of like just utilitarian or kind of embarrassing. Like a cuff, no, but it's really because you're going to grow out of it. So, and my mother would always say, we need to leave room to grow. So that image kind of overlaid the image of Paul helps me a lot, this idea of you put on Christ, but in a way that leaves you room to grow. That at first, when you put on those clothes that leave you room to grow, it's a little awkward. It's like there's a lot of room, you don't fill it out. It doesn't feel fitting entirely. It doesn't fit. But eventually, you hope to grow into it in a way that it not only fits, but is a fitting expression of who you are. So anyway, that's where that title comes from. So, although it's not said much here, these are unapologetically, they're sermons. They're sermons of a particular kind. I mean, there are more in devotional of nature. I mean, it doesn't deal with social issues, which my preaching does on occasion. It doesn't deal with kind of the issues of the day or what have you. It's more devotional. But may I read a portion here? And I thought I'd read this last. I looked at this today, trying to think of what I could read that wouldn't be too long, and rather than be plunked down in the middle of a sermon and to read that, I thought I'd read the last meditation here, which is quite brief. Ask for your patience, maybe 8 minutes, something like that. This was brought to me also because I recently, in the last couple of weeks, revisited this church that I make reference to in Burlington, Vermont, and so I also thought, because it's near the end of the book, some of you might not have gotten that far, so this will be new for you. So this is a meditation called The Cloud of Witnesses. After I was called as senior minister of First Congregational Church in Burlington, Vermont. By the way, I'm just going to interrupt once to say I was 27 years old, right? So when John was called to this church, could we call someone so young? It's like, come on, here we go. Anyway, so after I was called as senior minister of First Congregational Church in Burlington, Vermont, I was given a tour of the building by a church member. When we got to the formal church parlor, I paused to take in the portraits of my predecessors hanging on the walls. With something like awe, I said, "There they are, the cloud of witnesses." I was only 27 years old at the time, in many ways too young to know that I was too young to be taking on this job. But even then, I knew that I would need all the help I could get to run my leg of the race. Soon thereafter, and every Wednesday morning for 9 years, I led a Bible study in that room. The group were gathered, made up largely of women in their 70s and 80s, had been meeting there each week for longer than they could remember, which meant for some of them since before I was born. We used the format that they had been using for all those years. We would read the Bible passages to be used in worship that week, and then we would pray together. At first, I prepared my lessons with meticulous care, brandishing all of the historical critical methods of scholarship I had learned in seminary. There was so much that I wanted to communicate. The women in the class listened with what seemed to be genuine interest as I demonstrated my academic acumen. They would ask follow-up questions, which I took to be something like asking for an encore performance. Over time, however, the focus and tenor of the class began to change. The members of the class began gently to redirect the conversation to the ways in which the Bible passages were speaking to what was going on in their lives. They also began to bring in what was going on in the congregation and in the world, and seeking to know what the Bible might say about that. When it came time for offering prayer requests, I would often learn more about what was going on in the lives of my parishioners than I would in any other way. They were lovingly brooding over the congregation with their prayers, as well as over their young minister who was still learning his way around the congregation. During my first winter there, the first big snowstorm happened on a Wednesday morning. I couldn't get out of my driveway. Not yet accustomed to life in Vermont, I was a bit surprised that when I called the church office, someone was there to answer the phone. I said, "Quite a storm, isn't it? Obviously, we won't be having Bible study today." The person on the other end of the line replied, "Well, I'll go tell the ladies. They'll be so disappointed." Sure enough, they were all there, with Bibles open, waiting dutifully for their new young minister who didn't even know how to get out of his own driveway. They never teased me about that directly, but conversation did turn to weather conditions with suspicious frequency after that. One day I gave the class a dissertation on the need to move beyond exclusively male language in reference to God. I thought I was introducing a potentially radical concept to the group. The next week, one member quietly sought me out before class. She had a book of prayers she wanted to show me. It had been given to her by her mother some 70 years earlier. She had marked several passages that referred to God using female imagery, as mother as well as father. Without a hint of reprimand, but more to share a sense of wonder, she said, "There really is nothing new under the sun." Through the years, I came to look forward to those classes as an opportunity to teach, to be sure, but even more as a chance to learn. During one class, in response to a hurtful episode that required her to forgive, Thelma Connor said, "I have taken the whole episode, thrown it in the deepest part of the pond, and put up a sign that says, 'No fishing.'" That remains one of the best descriptions of forgiveness I know. Thelma Norton, when she was about to say something critical of a fellow church member, would always stop herself by saying, "Well, I'll just say amen to that," and then move on. I often invoke that phrase now myself when I'm in a similar position. And Marjorie Perrin wisely commented on the need to confront someone who is heading down a dangerous path. "When you reach my age, you realize that you don't have time to waste on anything but the truth." But beyond any specific words of advice I received, that group helped shape me by showing me what a Christian life looks like. It is, among other things, showing up week after week, in and out of season, supporting one another in difficult times, letting prayers expand the scope of our concern, having an eye trained to spot the one in need, practicing forgiveness, staying open to whatever new thing God might be doing. Nothing dramatic, perhaps, and yet How remarkable. A while back, I had the opportunity to return to that church after many years away. Among other things, I wanted to go to the church parlor. Not much had changed, except now my portrait hung among those of my predecessors. What I most wanted to experience in that room, however, was the continued presence of the members of that Wednesday morning Bible study group, almost all of whom had since died. I felt a need to express my gratitude for their faithfulness, and of course, to be cheered on for my leg of the race, that unlike theirs was not yet complete. And sure enough, there they all were, like a cloud of witnesses, and in ways that went beyond my imagining. Well, thank you. I've now done what I set out to do, and want to just respond to wherever you want to take this conversation, or if there are reflections or questions, and yeah. Yes, oh my goodness, you have a question. Do you really? Or you just want to raise your hand? It feels good, right? And others of you, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Gosh, somebody else is intruding here. There we go.
You were talking about almost writing them backwards.
Yeah.
To write for the written word.
Yeah, that may be inside baseball kind of talk, but yes, that's right. Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
But when you did that, did you find that for on any of these that the message changed for you, or that the intent that you'd originally had when you wrote them?
You know, I mean, it's funny when you're when you pour so much of yourself into a sermon, and something John and I have in common, we take this really seriously. I mean, it's an important moment. I mean, we have that, whether 18 minutes or whatever, 15 minutes, 18 minutes, it's like, and you realize it's really precious, and you pour so much into it, and then afterwards you might say, oh yeah, we did it, or not bad, or like, okay, it was a base hit, but a base hit is something, you know. But whatever. I mean, you take it so seriously, and then you have a sense, in some instances, say that's really good work. If you've worked hard at it, and you feel okay about it, whatever. And then you going back and read what you've done is very humbling. You say, really? And so that was more the revelation, as it were. And part of it is to recognize that whatever's on the page is not what happened. There's phrases used in preaching circles, but kind of a homiletical moment. And to read what you've written, yet like years later, is a little bit like maybe an image that works is like looking at lightning bugs you've captured in a jar, and there doesn't seem to be any light there. And you say, what was all the big deal about it? I wanted to go capture them in a jar, and what that taught me is something I knew, but it was a very strong reminder of, is that again, there's something that happens. A sermon is not something that a preacher does. It's something that happens in the interaction between preacher and congregation in a moment. I mean, you know this, right? I mean, you'll be sitting in a pew, and you'll feel that this is a moment, that something's been said here that's, and if you try to say, okay, and it might be lunch afterwards when you are talking to somebody who wasn't there, oh, this was just wonderful. And let me tell you about what happened. And then you recount it and you say, but that's not it. Does that make sense? Whatever.
And I remember trying to tell people about John's sermon.
Yeah.
Lexington. You can't do
I mean, it's to me, it's the lightning bug in a jar. I mean, it's just say after and try to capture that. And so let me make this into a faith statement, which it really is, which is to say that the Holy Spirit is in the room. And I mean, how do you capture that on a page? How do you? And it's the words are the vehicle, but they're not the event. I mean, they're not the thing. The thing is what happens when the word is released in the room and among people who are receptive and leaning toward it and whatever. So, yeah, maybe that's what I would say.
So I really liked that chapter in particular.
Thank you.
One of the reasons a number of us in the room are not quite Thelma years, but closing in. And I was going to suggest to you that in another book or in another, you might want to consider a chapter called Becoming Thelma. Because when you experience that, you experienced that Thelma as a 27-year-old. And I'll bet if you met the Thelmas now, you would feel differently about, I mean, you probably still like them as much, but I think you might find more resonance. Because I like to think of the Thelma years
The Thelma years. That's just beautiful. Just beautiful.
as wisdom years, right?
Wisdom years. Yeah.
Where you want to help and give back and feel like you're helping the young people.
Helping the young 27-year-old minister.
Yeah. No.
I mean,
For instance.
But I mean, there's something really wonderful in growing into that role. And you're not quite there yet, but you will be soon. But I think a lot of what you do at the seminary
Yeah.
is counsel. So I just
Right. That's great. That's great. So so many things occur to me to say. So I remember my father was a pastor saying, I remember being the promising young minister, and I remember approaching retirement. I just don't remember anything in between. And but Thelma Norton, and I so appreciate your lifting her up, because I didn't say here, and it was just not, in writing this, it wasn't relevant. That she was on the staff of the church when I got there, and she was in her 80s, probably maybe late 70s. And she was in this kind of old school role of a parish visitor. She would call on the people in the church. And I learned so much from her. And it wasn't that she ever set out to teach me something, or maybe she did, but it was, she covered her tracks really well. It just basically observed how she went about her work, and how she responded to people in the congregation, and how she talked about them. And she was my biggest supporter. And it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. Anyway, so I appreciate your lifting up her, and I just love lifting up her name. I don't know, in church circles, how often that happens, but she was one of the great saints. Yeah.
I thought I would try to pass on a question from someone that was disappointed she wasn't here tonight, but instead, because I think that would be even harder than capturing the lightning bug in the jar. I'm going to share my experience and try to get your reaction, and I would like some help from some other people that were in the discussion group.
Okay.
So we were discussing give
Yeah.
And we had one member of the class that had this very emotional reaction
Hmm.
to, oh, give thanks to the Lord for everything.
Hmm.
Because that very morning she had read more about the horrible Syrian crisis, and how could she possibly
Yeah.
give thanks for the mother and the infant that were found dead on the beach. And she truly had this heart-wrenching reaction that how can both of those things coexist? And it just, we all reacted in our own way, but if
Yeah.
you could react to that, please.
Wow. Yeah. Just even as I start out, I'm sure that whatever I say will not be adequate to that question. So where I would start maybe is by saying that it's and the other blessing to me personally about this project was that I basically looked at this range of things I've been preaching about over years, and one of the recurrent themes, what everybody has recurring themes, or they'll say that every preacher has basically between 1 and 10 sermons. I mean, and re-preaches them in one form or another, or the kind of recurring themes, and one that became clear to me that I kept going back to is that that Jesus really focuses on how we act rather than how we respond, how we feel. So, pray constantly. Do good to your neighbor. Pray for those who pray for your enemies. Turn the other cheek. These are all actions rather than responses, rather than feelings. And so stick with that for a minute and say, what is that? Why is that? Well, in part at least, it's because feelings are not within our control, either positive or negatively. You can't say, you can't say, well, somebody hits you on the cheek, you can't say, okay, now you must feel all sorts of wonderful things about this person who's just hit you. That's not within our control. What is in your control is what you do. And you turn the other cheek, whether you feel like it or not. Jesus is saying, I don't really, in that moment, I'm not focused on it. I don't care what you're feeling, do it. And it's not just that the actions matter, which is certainly the case, but that in some way over time, our actions influence how we feel. And as Millard Fuller, who was the co-founder of Habitat for Humanity, say, more people act their way into a new way of thinking than think their way into a new way of acting. I mean, that's, and I mean, I could go on about this for a long time, but I think that's a theme in Scripture. So this give thanks in all circumstances, we don't, and I think I said in that sermon, no one is born thankful. I love babies, but spend a little time with a baby, and no one is born thankful. And how does one become thankful? How does one become? And by the way, just a little sidebar. There's a lot being written now about gratitude and thankfulness and how important it is and whatever. But how does one become thankful? And I think that admonition, give thanks in all circumstances, is the best response to that. It's a practice. It's a discipline, if you want to think of it that way. It's a way of life, giving thanks. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do, or because it's being polite or being faithful or whatever, but that it begins to shape our lives in a way that our lives are shaped by gratitude. So let me go to the hard example of in that circumstance. It is not ignoring or diminishing the terrible things that are happening, but it's saying, even in this circumstance, how might my life not be shaped by resentment, anger? How might it be shaped by thankfulness? I don't know, that may be the best I can do.
I'm curious. In seminary school, you spend a lot of time studying the Bible and other religions. But how much time is spent shaping the 27-year-old to move into the first congregation and deal with the people issues and deal with the Thelmas of the world? If I were to look in a course offering, would I find that class in there, or is it more about Bible study? That's a naive question, I suppose.
No, that's a really good question, and the kind of ongoing question about how much a seminary can do. I mean, what's the best way to learn about working with people? Is it a classroom setting, or is it somewhere else? I mean, that's so there are some classes on leadership and worship leadership, but also leadership more generally, that sort of thing. But how much can be done in a classroom is really a question. And some seminaries stress the practical more than the it's not theoretical, but like the biblical theological kind of background, and some will stress more about the practical training. Andover Newton, where I serve as president, has always prided itself on training learned clergy, but with an emphasis toward really what do folks need to serve the church. And some of that's in the classroom, but some of it's in partnership with congregations. Because there's certain things you just can't learn in the classroom. Yeah. Yeah, John.
So I think probably every one of us in the room who has tried on Christ, shares that sense that the clothes don't quite fit. They're too big.
Right.
There's room to grow, and I'm curious in thinking about with you the other side of that, which is the growth. So for those of us who are walking around in clothes that don't quite fit,
Yeah.
what might be a way to, if not grow all the way into them, start to make them a little more snug?
Well, what a great question. What a great question. So first, I'm going to critique the question a little bit, and then let me respond. So good liberal folks, and I'm just I'm using this like theologically liberal folks, tend to be comfortable in talking about growth. It's not too challenging in the sense that, well, grow, sure, I'll grow, because it feels like you grow, little increments. You grow even without being aware of growing. You grow without even deciding to grow. It's it's kind of, and other folks, other Christian folks tend to emphasize decision more than growth. So are you born again is kind of or have you given your life to Christ is a kind of a decision question. So you have growth and you have decision, and what I would say is that the growth people probably need to think about decision more, and the decision people need to think about growth more. And the way I think about that is, and there's a place for both. Just like, I mean, this is in my mind, whatever, so our son got married on Saturday, he's calling me from his honeymoon in Chile, that there's a place for the slow unfolding, flowering of a love, and there's a place for the decision to marry. And you might say, okay, one leads to the other, the slow unfolding of love, and then there's decision to marry. But there are also ways in which the decision to marry allows for a flowering of the love. So it's not so clear that it's one and then the other. It's kind of there's a dynamic there. Anyway, that's not your question, but so I think there's a place for both. And for growing in faith, I mean, as you know, John, I mean, that was like a huge phrase at Village Church, is growth in faith. Because we say, no matter where, I don't know if you say this in your church, but like UCC, no matter where you are in life's journey, you're welcome here. It's like accepting people where they are. Well, I think we need to also say we accept you where you are, and we promise not to leave you there. Right? I mean, we're about some form of growth that's like, okay, you're here, and we're gonna walk with you, because nobody's arrived. We'll walk with you there. So what allows for that growth? It's all the things you're doing, but I think it's great to be explicit about it. That it's worship. If I were to say, when I began in ministry where I am now, kind of the formative role of worship, I've come to appreciate more and more. I mean, I think it's central. Study, service, and indeed being in community with one another. I mean, this is all kind of like standard stuff, but those are ways in which, and those don't make growth happen. It's more like creating conditions in which creating a space for God to create the growth. It's not like a self-improvement plan, as you know. I mean, I'm not saying that you don't know. Is there more you wanted me to say about that, or steer me in a different direction?
No, I think that's helpful. I appreciate your clarification on that, and I appreciate your insight on the limit of conversation about growth, and
Yeah.
the role of decision and all of this.
Yeah, it really is both, and again, if we were a group of, and I don't mean to presume, but if I were speaking to a group of born again Christians talking about when did you decide for Christ, I mean, these are kind of phrases I would say, okay, that language is really limited. But when we are so much more, or I'm used to being in conversation with folks who are much more used to using the language of growth to say, okay, what's the other part of that? We love the language of journey, and my friend Tony Robinson said, well, yeah, what if you actually arrived? What would you do then? I mean, was there be any, is there any, anyway.
One of my favorite chapters was the barn building chapter.
The
Barn building.
barn building, yeah.
And when we talked about that as a group, the sort of implication of the chapter is you're building barns or you're doing all the things that are important.
Yeah.
But as you read obituaries, that person
Yeah.
in the Boston Globe would be famed barn so we sort of mused on that a little bit, but then we said, I think Milton and Newton are similar in this regard.
Okay.
That this is a very difficult place because there's, first of all, the economics of the town make it that people have to work very, very hard
Yeah,
to pay the bills.
sure.
And, we're very driven towards doing the best for our children and et cetera, et cetera. So, if you were to think back as a pastor and maybe if you think about what we could do,
Yeah.
how do we as a church, before people get to be my age, help people achieve a better balance and spend more time on the important things? I mean, seriously.
Yeah, I know. I know it's a really good question. I'm like, how the heck do I answer that question? Yeah. Well, what I tried to say in that sermon is that we all intend to tomorrow. It's like tomorrow is the repository of all the unfulfilled hopes, aspirations, and even kind of the commitments of say, yes, that is who I am tomorrow. Yes, that's what I will do tomorrow. And the poignancy of that parable of Jesus is that possibility is cut off. It's like, and the piece in that sermon that sort of the kind of core of that, or the kernel there that got me started in that sermon was my father's wine. This idea that he stored this wine that was given to him, and he would have loved to have, the ceremony. It's not about drinking the wine; it's about the occasion, and that occasion never came. And so and the point of, and that's where that phrase, those of you who didn't read the sermon or didn't read it carefully, whatever, but the phrase "eat, drink, and be merry" comes from. I mean, that kind of common phrase comes from this parable of Jesus, because this farmer who keeps being burdened by his success with his crops and needs to build bigger barns. So yeah. And then he said, at some point I'm going to sit back and eat, drink, and be merry. And that time just never came. And there's a real poignancy about that, which I felt in a very kind of personal way around thinking about that. And there, so I've lost track of what your question was.
I get the point.
Yeah. So
But
what?
We have a very young congregation.
Yeah.
Our average age
Praise be.
is in the 40s, and we have
That's great.
We have a huge number of families with young children.
Yeah, that's great.
And it's a blessing.
Yeah.
And I think the more mature, dearly love
Yeah.
these families. What, again, from a wisdom-year perspective, and with John as our leader, one of the things that we want to be a family, a congregation that enriches families.
Not great.
In ways that, not just church, Sunday school, but really making families stronger and more fulfilled.
Yeah, that's great.
And this is a wonderful inspiration for that, because I think any of us would have loved to have somebody say to us when we were in our 20s or 30s, here's some ways to preserve, to make that balance work. Here's the ways not to put things off until tomorrow.
Right.
And do something purposeful as a community
Yeah, so let me take another stab at this.
Well, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Just where I- there you go.
Here we go.
Is it eat, drink, and be merry, or is it just lead meaningful lives, which is what I see as John is leading us to do? Is it eat, drink, and be merry to me is frivolous Mardi Gras
Right.
versus
So I think if I may, what I think is that Jesus' point there is if we can postpone even those things, it will also postpone more significant things. In fact, I think I said in that, I lost track of this, but I do believe that there's an irony that the most important things in life are the most easily postponed. I mean, think about that. Well, what cannot be postponed? It's like running the errands, fixing the roof. The most important things in life are the most easily postponed. Develop a relationship with someone. Develop a relationship with God. I mean, it tends not to make it on to the to-do list. And a significant question to ask might be of anyone. Actually, this would be an interesting, although kind of threatening parlor game. Is ask people, what are you postponing in your life? What are you postponing? And my hunch is that you're going to hear, if people are really talking out of their depths, you're going to hear some really significant things, what folks are postponing. And you might even ask that, I don't know, and I just toss this out there, as a church, what are you postponing? What are you focused on, and what are you postponing? And the question may also reveal some. It may be true as a church that the most important things you're postponing rather than focused on. I don't know that, but just ask it as a question. I'm not sure I have more to say that would be helpful about that. So maybe at like one or two, and then kind of like, this is the chance if you have something you really want to say, and it doesn't need to be a question. It could be something that just the conversation has prompted.
What was the most? Okay,
Frank, and then I am going to give you the last word. So we're going to Frank, and then we're yeah.
He always gets me.
That's great.
The chapter on who you're inviting to the party.
Yeah.
As it was going on, it said, who would do that? Invite people that don't fit,
Yeah.
don't get along with you.
Right.
Problem.
Right.
Because then your party's going to be a flop.
Right.
But then as it evolved a little bit with the church, with the
Right. That's
people and
right.
all that,
It's a true story.
It put a real
Yeah.
different
True story.
tone.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Right.
But,
Yeah.
most of us are not going to invite someone who we detest to
Yeah.
our party.
Right. Yeah. So I think church is a great place to practice that. I mean, because the church and the family are two places where we learn how to get along with those people we can't stand. I mean, and if you're, I mean, I once said this in a sermon, something like that, and I said, and if there's someone here in this church you can't stand, then you need to draw closer, because if you're really engaged, there's going to be somebody. And there was a relatively new member of the church who came up and said, well, I was just baffled because everybody here has been wonderful, to us as a couple, and we're just loving it here. There's nobody came to mind, whatever. And then several months later, she came up and said, "Remember that sermon that I?" She said, I kind of get it now. So no, I mean this. I mean this quite seriously. I don't mean to be just flippant about it. That I think a church. I think church. The reason why this illustration goes to a church is in some ways we were able to do that as a church in ways that we couldn't do it in other kinds of configurations of people, making room for folks who are different and are different from us, and making room at the table and being engaged with people that we otherwise wouldn't be. So I think church is a wonderful place for many reasons, but that's one of them, I would say.
So we asked him, so somebody else.
No, please.
No, he asked
Oh,
what I was going to ask.
Oh, is that right? Oh my goodness. Well, then that's it. Thank you. Or you have something? Yeah.
Yeah, no, just bridges off something Frank said, and then the chapter that you read to open things up. I feel like personally sometimes when I walk into a setting where I have a preconceived idea of how it's going to go or what my value is in that setting,
Yeah.
I often realize how much I don't know or how much I can learn from the people around me. And I think church is a setting where you really do have to embrace, well, you don't have to, but we embrace people and accept them where they are. And I think there's so much to learn from everybody who's part of this conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, really. I mean, I really hesitate to use the image of family related to a church, but in this way, family and church are similar in this regard. I mean, we're thrown together, and we didn't choose each other. So I think, and there's something about sticking with the ones you're stuck with. And that's a beautiful thing, and whether it's in a family or in a church, and I know they're different, but think of that in our culture. Where else does that happen? It doesn't happen really many other places, and it's a very precious thing, I would say. Well, thank you. I so appreciate this conversation, and also just that. When you write a book, it's different than when you preach a sermon. It's like I shot an arrow in the air. Where did it land? I know not where. So it's wonderful. Thank you. You've blessed me by engaging what I wrote, and again, it's wonderful to be here with you. Thank you. Thank you.